What does the all-time Premier League table look like? Well, it looks like this. This is the all-time Premier League table. But today we are having a deeper dive into the Premier League numbers and working out the Premier League table of all time based on points per game. That table I have just shown you has shown you who's got the most points in the Premier League since it's been going in 1992. But today we are going to have a deeper dive into the numbers and working out the all-time Premier League table based on points per game. There's been 51 different teams to feature in the Premier League since its formation in 1992. Yes, that does mean we're not including teams that have been in there since before 1992 and what they've picked up in that time, because the top flight of English football has been around for over 100 years. This would be a ridiculous table. We're looking at just the Premier League only from 1992 to where we are now. Just before we get into this table then, do make sure to show this video some support. Let's go for 599 likes. Do make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you haven't already. Do make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already subscribed. It is free to do and you'll see all of our videos when they go out, including Premier League predictions, which are back tomorrow. And do share your opinions on the table down in the comments. With all that said and done, let's get into some of the numbers. So then, starting at the bottom of this 51 place table based on points per game, we have a few teams here. Let's go through them from the bottom, working our way up. First of all, we have Luton Town, who are of course new to the Premier League this season. They were in the top flight up until the season it became the Premier League, so missed out then. And you do need to take these numbers with a pinch of salt. They've only played 12 Premier League games and they've picked up 6 points in those 12, giving them a 0.5 points per game, which is the lowest out of all the teams featuring in today's video. I'm sure they will improve that through the season. But remember, they've got to be aiming around 1 point per game to stay up. 35 points probably will keep them up, which is just under a point per game. And another thing I need to mention in this video as well is, not that the Premier League was easier before, but I do think it has been harder in recent years. So teams that have featured in recent years, I do think they've got it tougher now. Next up, you've got Huddersfield Town, who spent 2 seasons back to back in the Premier League from 2017 till 2019. They picked up 53 points across 76 games. They actually did very well in their first season, beating the drop. They were relegated in the second season with not a great points total, giving them 0.69 points per game for their time in the Premier League. After that, you find Swindon Town. They only featured in the Premier League once in the 1993-94 season, picking up 30 points in 42 games. Yes, you haven't heard me wrong, it was 42 games back then in the Premier League. Of course, it's now 38 games, giving Swindon a 0.71 points per game. Just above them, Bradford City, also a team that hasn't spent a great amount of time in the Premier League. They spent 2 seasons there, 1999 to the 2000 season and 2000 to 2001. They obviously stayed up just about in their first season, but were relegated in their second season in 2001. Bottom of the table, picking up 62 points in the 76 games they played in the Premier League, giving them 0.81 points per game. Then you've got Cardiff City, another team that have spent 2 seasons in the Premier League. They were not back to back. They've spent 2 single seasons in the Premier League, getting relegated in both of them, picking up 64 points in 76 games, giving Cardiff City 0.84 points per game. Next up, you find Hull City with 0.9 points per game, 171 Premier League points picked up in total across 5 seasons, being relegated 3 times from the Premier League. Next up, you got Barnsley with 0.92 points per game, picking up 35 points from 38 games when they featured in the Premier League in the 1997-98 season. They were relegated that season. I do think though 35 points in 38 games now probably would be enough to stay up, but it wasn't enough for most of the seasons in the 90s. Moving up the table then, we've got another cluster of teams. Let's have Watford next with 0.94 points per game, 285 points picked up over 304 games, a bigger sample size here. It has featured 3 relegations for Watford. Just above them, you find West Bromwich Albion with 0.99 points per game. They've actually spent quite a bit of time in the Premier League since its formation. 490 points picked up in 494 games, nearly 1 point per game. West Bromwich Albion have been relegated from the Premier League 5 times, I must mention, which does weigh them down a little bit, but they have been in the Premier League quite a few seasons. Burnley up next, the first team to feature with just over 1 point per game, 1.01 points per game, with 329 points picked up in 316 games. They are currently in the Premier League, currently bottom. I'm sure they will improve. I don't think they're going to finish bottom this season. This is their 9th season in the Premier League since its formation. Then we have Norwich City with 1.02 points per game. I'm not entirely surprised to see Norwich City in the bottom 10 of this video. They have played 392 Premier League games, but Norwich City hold the record for the most relegations in Premier League history with 6 relegations. They just have above a point per game. Level with them is Blackpool. Blackpool have only spent 1 season in the Premier League in the 2010-11 season, picking up 39 points in 38 games. In most seasons, that is enough to get you over the line, but it wasn't in that season. I remember that season. The final day was crazy, with Birmingham City, Blackpool, Wolves, Blackburn and Wigan all separated by about 1 point going into that final day. Blackpool were actually really decent when they were in the Premier League. They picked up some decent results, and even on the final day led at champions Manchester United, but eventually went on to lose 4-2 and were relegated from the Premier League in their first season in the Premier League. Let's move up the table some more. Next up we have got Sunderland, also with 1.02 points per game. They've spent quite a lot of time in the Premier League. 608 games in the Premier League for Sunderland, 618 points picked up, which does have them above a point per game. They've suffered 4 relegations in that time, so despite some strong seasons from Sunderland in the Premier League, finishing fairly high up the table, 4 relegations will weigh down their points per game. Another team with 1.02 points per game is Sheffield United, with 214 points picked up in 210 Premier League games. They are currently below a point per game in this Premier League season. Will they avoid the drop? We will wait and see. Just above them you find Derby County with 1.03 points per game, 274 points picked up in 266 Premier League matches. To be fair, that's decent going from Derby County when you do have to remember and factor in that they had 1 season in 2007-8 where they only picked up 11 points, the worst points return from a Premier League team ever, but they are overall just above a point per game. Next up you find Reading with 1.04 points per game. They've featured in the Premier League for 3 seasons, and just above them we find Oldham Athletic with 1.06 points per game. They have featured in 2 Premier League seasons, picking up 89 points from 84 games. Moving up the table some more, we find AFC Bournemouth with 1.08 points per game. Remember, they had a 5-year Premier League spell with Eddie Howe in charge. They're now into their 2nd season in the Premier League since returning. 259 points picked up in 240 games for them. Level with them, Wigan Athletic, 1.08 points per game as well. 331 points from 304 Premier League games. Decent going from Wigan Athletic. Then next up we have a few teams with 1.1 points per game. Let's go to Portsmouth. They spent 7 seasons in the Premier League, picking up 293 points in 266 Premier League matches. Queen's Park Rangers next with 308 points picked up in 278, also giving them the same points per game. And Ipswich Town also on the same points per game with 224 Premier League points picked up in 202 Premier League games. Just above them we find Fulham with 1.13 points per game. They've picked up 704 points in 620 games, which is 15th in the table for most Premier League points picked up. Next then we find Birmingham City, also on 1.13 points per game with 301 points picked up over 266 games. They've spent 7 seasons in the top flight with a decent points per game return. The same as them, Crystal Palace with 1.13 points per game, picking up 624 points from 552 games, a bigger sample size than Birmingham's there. Next after them we find Wolverhampton Wanderers with 1.14 points per game, 404 points picked up in 354 Premier League appearances. Pretty good going there from Wolves. They've been pretty solid in the Premier League since their return, but I do remember that season in 2010-11 when they just about stayed up despite losing to Blackburn Rovers on the final day. They did go down the following season with Mick McCarthy and Terry Connor as the managers. Next after them is Bolton Wanderers with 1.16 points per game, 575 points picked up in 494 appearances. Bolton for me were always a pretty decent team when they were in the Premier League, and this points per game reflects that. They're also level with Middlesbrough, 1.16 points per game picked up, 661 points picked up in 574 Premier League games. Level with those two is my side Coventry City, 1.16 points per game, 409 points picked up in 354 appearances. We did spend a long time in the top flight from the late 60s up until 2001, but it's only from 1992 to 2001 which is included because it's a Premier League specific video. And next up then we have a load of teams piled up on 1.17 points per game. First up, Swansea City in 22nd place with 312 points picked up in 266 games. Southampton with the same points per game, 1,088 points picked up in 924 appearances. I know there has been plenty of Premier League seasons where Southampton have been in that bottom 5 or 6 and just got over the line, but they've spent a long time in the top flight, from its formation up until 2005, and then from 2012 until last season. In fact, when you look at just Premier League points picked up alone, they are 11th in that table. Above them, you'll find Nottingham Forest, who of course returned to the Premier League in 2022. They have suffered 2 relegations from the Premier League since its formation in 1992. They actually picked up 1 point per game exactly and 1 goal per game exactly last season. This season, I expect them to be above that. Overall, 1.17 points per game, with 290 points picked up in 248 Premier League games for Nottingham Forest. Just above them are Charlton, 1.18 points per game for Charlton in the Premier League, 361 points picked up in 304 Premier League matches. That's pretty good going for Charlton. I think the bulk of that was under Kirbishley, and they were a pretty solid Premier League side when I was growing up, in the early years of me growing up in the early 2000s, and then they did go down and they haven't returned to the Premier League since. They currently reside in League One. And just above them we find Stoke City with 1.2 points per game picked up, 457 points from 380 Premier League games. I remember they had that long spell in the Premier League from Tony Pulis up until they were relegated around 2018. So then moving on to the top 17, we find Brighton next with 1.2 points per game, the same as Stoke City there, with 290 points picked up in their 240 Premier League matches. Like I say, they've only been in the Premier League for the last 5 years or so, but they've been a good addition to the Premier League. They've finished in the top half quite a few times now, and they are a solid Premier League regular. Above them, maybe to your surprise, you find Wimbledon, who were obviously in the top flight up until the year 2000, and there's been so much going on at Wimbledon, including them having to build the club up again. AFC Wimbledon, 1.24 points per game from their time in the top flight, 374 points picked up in 300 Premier League appearances. That's very good going, so fair play to Wimbledon. Just above them, you find Sheffield Wednesday, also on the same points per game, 1.24 points per game, with 392 points picked up in 316 matches. Also relegated in the same year Wimbledon were, in the year 2000. Neither of them have returned to the top flight since. Can you see either of them doing it in the near future? Do let us know down below. Above them you find West Ham United, just above, 1,315 Premier League points picked up across 1,046 games, which does have West Ham United in 10th place if you're just looking at Premier League points picked up, not points per game. Above them, Leicester City, 1.26 points per game, 821 points picked up across 650 appearances. Of course, we need to mention Leicester City did win the Premier League itself outright in 2015-16. They have actually been relegated to the Championship. That happened last season, but they are looking to make a swift return this season. Just above them, we find Aston Villa. They've spent most of their time since the Premier League's formation in the Premier League, except of course for that 3-year spell they spent in the Championship from 2016 to 2019. 1.33 points per game. We are starting to look at some decent points return here. 1,444 Premier League points picked up by Aston Villa across 1,088 Premier League games. Just above them we find Everton in 11th place with 1.34 points per game, 1,614 Premier League points picked up, and they are the first team to feature in this video now that's been in the Premier League since its duration. They've been in the top flight bloody ages, but they have had some relegation battles where they've had to get over the line on the final day. This season, of course, they have been hit with a points deduction and could be fighting for survival again, but apart from the points deduction, I think they've actually been pretty good so far this season. But those battles with the relegation places has Everton's points per game a little bit lower than where they would be if you just look at points picked up, where they'd actually be 7th in the table. Next up then, let's move into the top 10 for points per game picked up since the Premier League's formation, and we find Brentford with 1.37 points per game. Brentford, of course, have only been in the Premier League since 2021, but they've slotted right in, they've made themselves feel at home, and they look like a Premier League regular, picking up 121 points in 88 Premier League matches. Above them, we find Blackburn, another team that's actually won the Premier League. They won the Premier League in the 94-95 season with a 1.39 points per game from their total time in the Premier League. 970 points picked up in 696 Premier League matches. Level with that is Newcastle United, albeit they have played more Premier League games. 1.39 points per game, 1,501 points picked up across 1,084 Premier League matches. Newcastle are a strong Premier League side. They haven't always been. Remember, under Mike Ashley, those battles with relegation, including 2 relegations themselves, but Newcastle firmly in the top 10 here. Then you get Leeds United in 7th place, 1.41 points per game picked up. Some of the younger generation won't remember Leeds United were very good in the 90s and before that as well, with 820 points picked up across 582 Premier League matches. Leeds United in 7th place here. So then here come the so-called Big Six. They are in the top 6, kicking it off with Tottenham, 1.56 points per game. Of course, another team that have been in the Premier League since its formation. 1,873 points picked up across 1,202 Premier League matches. Very good going there for Tottenham. For most of the Premier League time, they have been a top 6 side. They've had quite a few top 4 finishes. Then above them, we find Manchester City with 1.73 points per game. Once again, some of the younger generation might not realise that Manchester City were relegated from the Premier League in 2001. That's only 22 years ago, but they have been so impressive in the recent years that their points per game is gradually catching up with some of these top sides here. 1,746 points picked up across 1,012 Premier League matches for Manchester City. Next up, we're on to the top 4, and all of these have been in the Premier League since its formation. We have Chelsea with 1.82 points per game, 2,198 points picked up across 1,012 games. Just above them, Liverpool with 1.83 points per game, 2,203 points picked up across 1,202 games. They've picked up 5 more points than Chelsea since the Premier League's formation, so it's neck and neck between these two. In the 1990s, Liverpool would have finished ahead of Chelsea pretty much every season. In the 2000s, that changed as Chelsea became more powerful. In the 2000s, Chelsea won the Premier League a few times. In the 2010s, it fluctuated, Chelsea finishing ahead of Liverpool most of the seasons then. In the 2020s, Liverpool have obviously been better under Jurgen Klopp, winning the Premier League in 2020. Chelsea have won more Premier Leagues than Liverpool. I know Liverpool have won more top flight trophies, but despite Chelsea winning more Premier Leagues, Liverpool have picked up more points than Chelsea, having played the same amount of Premier League games. And Liverpool are just ahead of Chelsea based on points and points per game. And then we have the top 2, Arsenal and Liverpool. In 2nd place, it is Arsenal. They've won the Premier League 3 times since its formation, in 98, in 2002 and 2004 under Wenger. In the recent years under Arteta as well, they've looked close to winning a Premier League. They didn't do it last year. Maybe they'll do it this year. They've picked up 1.87 points per game, which is very, very good. It's the 2nd best out of the 51 teams to have featured in the Premier League, with 2,252 points picked up across 1,202 Premier League games. But of course, top of this table is Manchester United with 2.05 points per game, 2,462 Premier League points picked up over 1,202 Premier League games. It's incredible. This just goes to show how powerful Manchester United were in the 1990s and the 2000s, and even the early 2010s under Sir Alex Ferguson, that despite him not being there for the last 10 years, for them being a bit of a banter club in some people's opinions, they've not won the Premier League in 10 years. They've had some pretty poor seasons. They are still overall above 2 points per game. Just goes to show how brilliant Manchester United were under Sir Alex Ferguson. I will of course admit though that while they struggle and teams like Manchester City and Arsenal strengthen in these recent years, the gap will shut a bit, but you can see there's 0.18 points per game between Arsenal and Manchester United. That's quite a significant gap. Manchester United are top of the all-time Premier League table, and they're top of the all-time Premier League points per game table as well. So then guys, that wraps up today's video. It took me a little while digging through the numbers, so some support would really be appreciated. Do make sure you've dropped a like, and do let me know your thoughts on that table down below. Do you remember your team being in the Premier League if they're not in the Premier League now? And do let us know your opinions on some of the greatest Premier League teams since its formation in 1992. Drop a like, drop a comment, subscribe. I will see you all in the next video. Peace out.